Hello and welcome. This is Matt Scherer from PMA Practice Transitions, and I cover primarily the Ohio and Western Pennsylvania area, and I assist dental professionals in purchasing our selling practices. And my colleague here is?
I'm Joe Gordon. I do the same thing that Matt does, but I do it in Indiana and Northern Kentucky.
What's our subject today, Joe?
Our subject today is renting or buying real estate in a transaction for a practice.
Good topic.
Extremely important subject. A lot of people think that buying the practice will be the largest debt that they incur, but in a lot of practices, either the real estate, whether it is a buy or a lease, is actually the largest liability that you have over you. So we're going to spend a little time on both. So Matt, let's talk about buying real estate.
Well, it's certainly sometimes an option when somebody looks to sell their practice. If they own the real estate, some sellers don't want to be landlords, so they look to sell the real estate. How does that benefit you as a buyer? Certainly, typically when you buy real estate, you set up a separate entity that leases back to the dental entity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some, and you can talk about it probably better, but in a different segment, but there's some tax benefits behind that. Certainly with leasing, you've got to look at what type of lease it's going to be.
And with buying a real estate versus a lease, you have ultimate control of that real estate.
Absolutely.
When you purchase it, absent any zoning.
And it's another
restrictions,
asset,
things
right?
like that. And it's another asset. And you hope it appreciates. Now, don't think that you're going to retire on the appreciation on a building. That's probably not going to happen. Particularly if it's a standalone building for a dental practice. It's going to be part probably of your eventual sale somewhere down the line. But it does give you the flexibility to do what you want. Your costs per square foot are going to be lower over time, actually buying the real estate. And in a lot of instances, you almost have to buy the real estate that goes along with a practice, particularly those in rural areas that again, don't want to be landlords. So we look at that. You don't have to buy the building immediately when you buy the practice.
That's a good point.
We stagger them sometimes, but we come up with a fixed price for the real estate, up front, so we know what we're going to buy it and when the schedule of when we're going to
And I would add to that sometimes banks don't want to finance the whole transaction, so they'd like to see you lease for a year or two and then buy it. But getting into leases, what do you see as the most common type of lease?
Most common type you'll hear about are called triple net leases.
Yep.
And CPAs like myself and other professionals, we throw that around. And what does that really mean? What that really means is that as the lessor, you are responsible for all the costs associated with that building, absent few things that we might put in the lease agreement itself, structural things, things like that. But realize that if the air conditioning unit blows up a week after you take over that lease, that's your responsibility. And I've seen that happen, and nobody had a spare $15,000 sitting around they didn't have a good use for.
Right.
So that is something to take into account. A lot of times you'll be assuming a lease.
Yes.
It'll be a lease that the seller had already signed, and you will assume that. Just so many things within a lease you need to look at: renewal periods, escalators, what common area maintenance costs are there, what's your ability for signage, what's your ability for parking, hours, operations, things like that. So very important things that you engage a real estate attorney to look at that.
Most of the time an attorney can certainly help you through some of those issues, and I think you brought up a couple good ones. Signage is a big one, right? You got to see what kind of signage is allowed in that city or wherever the practice is located, and sometimes you're restricted on the size of the sign, how high the sign is, or whatnot. So you definitely want to look into those things. It's a personal preference. Again, some sellers, when they sell their practice and real estate, it's a combo deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's not it's not one or the other. And you know, if you're not into real estate or buying real estate, then maybe that's, you know, not the deal for you. But it's definitely a personal choice.
We obviously work with a lot of practices in helping them decide, you know, when they're selling, if we're going to sell the building at that time. And we work with buyers on them going into leases and purchasing buildings. The one thing that I do say on a lease, the last thing I'll say about it is that I always insist that we get the property inspected, just as if we were buying it if we're doing a triple net lease. So we avoid the air conditioner going out the first week that we're in the facility. And I think it's well worth the, you know, $300 or whatever it is to do that. So.
Yeah, and one last thing I would add is, you know, don't go and waste extra money on appraisals. The banks are always going to require an appraisal, and they're going to require the appraisal to be done by the bank. So if you go get your own, or the seller go gets their own appraisal, it's okay. It's just know that the banks typically won't use those appraisals because they have to order them through them, so, you know, through the bank themselves. So I think that concludes our lease/buy for today. We could certainly talk a little bit longer about it and more in depth, but we'll leave you with that. And we appreciate you joining us today. Give us a thumbs up if you like us, and definitely share this segment with one of your friends or colleagues. Thanks.